All right, welcome to another deep dive. So you know how this works? You send us the stuff you're curious about, and we kind of break it down, see what we can learn, and try to make some sense of it together. And today is no exception. We're diving into this idea, and it's kind of a fascinating one, of just everyday life.
Yeah.
You know, like the basic stuff becoming a little bit too much effort.
Yeah, too much effort, like more than just being lazy, right? Like there's this whole feeling out there, at least from what I've been seeing, that life itself, just by existing, is burdensome.
Yeah, and that's where that Japanese word comes in, mendokusai.
Mm.
It's more than just not wanting to do the dishes. It's like this sense of, ugh, life, why are you so complicated?
Exactly. And we're going to be using a book by a Japanese psychiatrist, Takashi Okada, who seems to be really focused on this whole mendokusai thing. And actually, one thing that really struck me from his work is that he points out that over 40% of single Japanese men, like in their 20s, have never even been in a romantic relationship.
Wow, that's a huge number. I mean, 40%, that's almost half.
Yeah, and what's even more interesting, well, I think anyway, is the reason, right? Like why? And nearly half of those guys said it was because relationships were just too mendokusai, too much effort.
Okay, so I'll admit, when I first saw that, I was like, really? Like, is finding someone to, go get coffee with or something really that much of a hassle?
Mm-mm.
But it seems like Okada's saying that it goes a lot deeper than that, right? It's not just about, like, not wanting to swipe on dating apps or whatever. It's more about this feeling of being completely overwhelmed by all of the, the potential rejection, all the emotional energy involved, like all of it.
Absolutely. And it's not just limited to, romantic relationships or dating. It can show up in friendships, family dynamics, work, you name it.
Yeah.
Have you ever felt this way about a potential job opportunity? Like you see it, maybe you even have the skills, the qualifications, but the entire process of applying, then doing the interviews, potentially being rejected, that just feels so daunting that you just, say, forget it, it's not worth it.
I think I've been guilty of that myself a time or two. There have definitely been times where I've kind of just let something that could have been a good opportunity slip by because I thought, it's too much effort.
And that's a good point, too. It's not like these are, lazy people or incapable people. It's just that the mental energy, the perceived effort kind of outweighs whatever the potential reward might be. Okada even compares it to like a psychological cost-benefit analysis.
Oh, interesting. So it's like their brains are constantly calculating, like, is this worth the hassle? And if the answer is no, then forget it.
Exactly. It's just too much. And actually, Okada takes this even further. He kind of connects this whole mendokusai attitude to something called Avoidant Personality disorder. It's also known as APD. And he's really clear it's not just a cultural quirk or just some random personality trait. It's a recognized psychological condition.
Now, APD might sound a bit, clinical, but to kind of break it down simply, it's basically that people with APD tend to have, low self-esteem. They have a deep fear of negative judgment, of being judged, and then a really strong tendency to just completely avoid any situation where those fears might come true.
It's almost like they're intentionally making their world smaller to avoid any possibility of being uncomfortable or criticized.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we're talking about a pretty serious pattern of avoidance here.
Yeah.
How does this connect to the whole mendokusai idea? Like, is mendokusai just another way of saying someone has APD?
Not exactly. APD is an actual clinical diagnosis, whereas mendokusai is, well, it's more like a word to describe this general feeling that everything is just burdensome. But Okada's argument is that there's a definite link. He sees mendokusai as a way that APD, like those fears and anxieties, express themselves in everyday life. It's like how those things show up.
So it's like mendokusai might be the tip of the iceberg, but underneath there's this whole, complex thing going on.
Right. And to really understand what's going on under there, we need to look at the key characteristics of APD. So we're back, diving deeper into this whole mendokusai thing and how it might be connected to avoidant personality disorder.
And last time we were talking about how some of those key characteristics of APD might actually be kind of expressed through this feeling of mendokusai, this sense that everything's just too much effort.
Yeah.
So what are some of the big things that Okada points to? What are some of those key characteristics?
Well, one of the biggest ones is this hypersensitivity to criticism or to rejection. For people who have APD, even the tiniest little bit of criticism can feel like really devastating.
Oh, I see. So it's like they're always kind of bracing themselves for the worst, always expecting to be judged or, to be found wanting in some way.
Yeah, exactly. And that fear of being judged, it makes it so hard for them to really put themselves out there. It's almost like they'd rather just completely avoid situations altogether than risk even the smallest chance of being criticized.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, right? Like, if even mild criticism feels like a huge deal, why would you want to put yourself in that position? But wouldn't that make it really hard to form close relationships?
It absolutely does. And that kind of leads into another key characteristic of APD, which is it's this difficulty showing their true selves. So even in close relationships, people with APD will kind of hold back, They're afraid to reveal what they're really thinking or feeling because they worry that they won't be accepted or liked for who they actually are.
Oh, wow. So it's like they're always wearing a mask, so to speak, and that's got to be exhausting.
It is. It's incredibly draining. And just imagine constantly second-guessing yourself, always worried about saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. It's no wonder that socializing, even with people you care about, can start to feel like a chore.
Yeah, it's like all that mental energy is going towards just trying to protect yourself. And this ties back to that low self-esteem we were talking about before, right?
Yeah, you got it. Low self-esteem is kind of at the root of APD. Often people with APD really believe, like deep down, that they're flawed in some way or that they're unlovable. And a lot of times that comes from their early experiences, like maybe they were neglected as children or constantly criticized.
So those early experiences almost create a kind of blueprint for how they see themselves and how they see their place in the world.
That's it. And that negative self-image, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because they believe they're unlovable. They avoid connection, which then, of course, reinforces that belief that they're unlovable. And it just keeps going.
It's a vicious cycle. And that makes the whole idea of putting yourself out there, whether it's in relationships, at work, or even just socially, it makes it seem really risky.
Exactly. The potential for pain feels so much bigger than any potential for joy. So avoidance becomes the default coping mechanism.
So we've talked about hypersensitivity to criticism. We've talked about the difficulty showing their true selves and that underlying low self-esteem. What else is there? Like, what else is part of this picture of APD?
Akana also talks about, he calls it excessive caution. He says that people with APD tend to overestimate the risks in almost every situation, and then at the same time, they kind of downplay the rewards.
So even simple things, everyday things, can start to feel mendokusai.
Yeah.
Because they're so focused on what might go wrong instead of what could be good about it.
It's like, imagine you're invited to a party. Most people would be thinking about the fun they'll have, the people they might meet, But someone with APD, they immediately jump to everything that could go wrong. Like, what if nobody talks to me? What if I spill something on myself? What if I say something stupid?
And suddenly, staying home and just watching TV sounds like a much better option.
Exactly. They've mendokusai'd themselves out of a potentially fun experience. But to get even deeper into the link between mendokusai and APD, Okada talks about the DSM. That's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Okay, so that's getting into the more clinical stuff, but why is that relevant to what we're talking about here?
Well, because Okada was actually involved in the proposed revisions for the criteria for diagnosing APD in the DSM-5. That's the most recent version of the manual. And one of the interesting things about those revisions is the emphasis on worry.
Worry? How does worry fit into APD?
It's not just about avoiding specific situations. It's about this constant sense of anxiety and dread that kind of underlies everything. They're preoccupied with all the negative things that could happen, with the worst case scenarios.
So it's not just, I don't want to go to that party. It's, what if something terrible happens at that party? Or what if I mess everything up?
Exactly. And that kind of worry, it can make even the most basic things feel overwhelming.
It makes sense, yeah. When you're living in that constant state of what if, it's no wonder that life starts to feel really mendokusai. But to kind of bring this back to real life, are there any examples that Okada gives of how this mendokusai mindset, how it plays out in people's lives?
He does. He talks about this young man who is super talented, like really skilled in computer programming and design. Actually, he was at a level that, most people don't reach until much later in life. But this guy had such a low opinion of himself that he just refused to believe that his talents were anything special. He was convinced that everyone else was way more skilled than him.
So instead of kind of pushing himself and, going for a career that really matched his abilities, he just stayed stuck.
Yeah, pretty much. He ended up taking these beginner-level courses in college, even though he was clearly capable of so much more. He was so afraid of being judged or being found inadequate that he basically sabotaged his own success.
Oh, man. That's kind of heartbreaking. It's like he let his fear of mendokusai, like that fear of effort and the possibility of failure, it completely stopped him.
And it wasn't just his career either. This fear of hassle, of failure, it expanded to his personal life too. He'd spend hours, like literally hours, overthinking the whole process of asking someone out on a date, just fixated on all the ways it could go wrong.
And then, of course, he never actually asked anyone out.
Nope, he mendokusai'd himself right out of any chance of, having a romantic relationship. He was so focused on avoiding that potential hassle that he missed out on all the potential joy. And Okada says that that overthinking and that risk aversion, it's at the core of this whole mendokusai thing.
So it's like their automatic response to everything is, okay, but what's the worst that could happen? And then they use that to justify doing absolutely nothing.
And he says that way of thinking, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, If you're always expecting the worst, then you're going to end up limiting your experiences and missing out on opportunities to grow and to connect.
Okada also mentions a young woman, right? I think he talks about how she was struggling with incredibly low self-esteem and anxiety. And then on top of that, she had all this pressure from her parents to succeed, which just created this constant feeling of not being good enough.
Yeah, and eventually all of that led her to drop out of college. She pretty much became a recluse for, over a decade.
Wow. So the weight of all those expectations, the fear of not measuring up, it all just became too much.
It's like the world outside of her little bubble became too mendokusai to even deal with.
But I thought you said this was one of Okada's examples of hope. So how does her story turn around?
Well, that's the interesting part. During those years of isolation, she found a lot of comfort in reading. Books kind of became her escape, her window to the world.
And that actually became a turning point for her.
Yeah. One day, she came across a job posting at a local bookstore, and even though she had all this anxiety, she actually worked up the courage to apply. And she got the job.
So she took a chance, and it paid off.
It did. And that bookstore became what Okada calls a safe base, a place where she felt accepted and valued for who she was. Remember, we talked about the importance of those safe bases for people struggling with APD and mendokusai.
Yeah, it's like a haven, a place where they can recharge and kind of gather this strength to face the world again.
Exactly. And for her, working at the bookstore gave her structure. It gave her a sense of purpose and accomplishment. It allowed her to slowly rebuild her confidence and start to, engage with life again at her own pace.
I love that. It shows that even after years of feeling trapped by mendokusai, it's never too late to find your way back. But we're not done with her story yet, are we?
You're right, we're not. It gets even more interesting when you start to think about it in terms of what Okada calls psychological allergy.
Okay, psychological allergy. Now that sounds intriguing. Is that like being allergic to stress or something?
That's a great question. He uses that term to describe how our minds can become overly sensitive to certain things in our environment, much like our bodies can develop allergies to certain substances.
So it's like, just as someone with a pollen allergy might start sneezing and wheezing when they're around flowers, someone with a psychological allergy might experience intense anxiety or that feeling of mendokusai when they're faced with certain social situations or demands.
Yeah, and Okada actually thinks that these psychological allergies might be becoming more common in today's world.
What makes him think that?
Well, just think about the sheer amount of information we're bombarded with every single day. Social media, news, work emails, it's constant. And he suggests that all this information overload, it can lead to a kind of mental fatigue, which then makes us crave disconnection and avoidance.
It's like our brains are just constantly in overdrive trying to process it all.
Exactly. And then on top of that, there's this constant pressure to achieve, to be successful, to have the perfect life. At least that's what, social media and society often tell us. And Okada says that this can lead to this chronic sense of inadequacy, this fear of failure, which then feeds right back into those avoidant tendencies.
So we're always chasing after something that feels just out of reach. And that's exhausting. No wonder people are feeling mendokusai.
Right. But here's the thing. Okada acknowledges the role that these societal factors might be playing, but he also emphasizes that we don't have to let these pressures control our lives. We have a choice. We can either let mendokusai hold us back, or we can use it as fuel to push ourselves forward.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we reclaim our lives from mendokusai and not let it win?
That's exactly what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay, so welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on this journey exploring mendokusai, that feeling of everything being just too much effort and how it connects to avoidant personality disorder.
And the good news is we're not just like dwelling on the problem here. We're actually moving towards solutions, looking at how Okada presents a really hopeful message about managing those mendokusai feelings and creating a life that feels less burdensome.
Okay, that's what I like to hear. Because honestly, life can be pretty demanding, even for people who don't struggle with APD. So where do we even start?
Okada really emphasizes self-awareness and acceptance, like understanding where these avoidant tendencies are coming from, recognizing that they're often rooted in fear, in wanting to protect ourselves.
Yeah, it's like our brains are trying to keep us safe, even if that means maybe missing out on some good stuff.
Exactly. He uses this great analogy of a turtle retreating into its shell. Like when we feel threatened or overwhelmed, it's natural to want to withdraw to protect ourselves. But if we stay in that shell for too long, we're missing out on the world outside.
Right, so it's about finding that balance between honoring our need for security, but also allowing ourselves to, grow and experience new things. But that's easier said than done.
Oh, absolutely. But he offers some really practical strategies. For example, he talks about setting realistic goals. Instead of aiming for this massive, overwhelming objective, break it down into smaller steps.
So instead of I'm going to find a new job, it's more like, okay, this week I'm going to update my resume. Makes it much less daunting, right?
Exactly. It's about making those first few steps feel achievable so you can build momentum. And as you accomplish those smaller goals, your confidence grows and you realize you can handle more than you thought.
You're kind of proving to yourself that you're capable, one step at a time.
Right. And he also talks about shifting your focus. Instead of dwelling on your shortcomings, what you think you're not good at, make a conscious effort to acknowledge your strengths, to celebrate your accomplishments, even the small ones.
So it's about challenging that inner voice, that negative self-talk that says, you're not good enough.
And replacing it with encouragement, with self-compassion. Okada emphasizes that everybody makes mistakes, everyone has areas where they can improve, and that's okay. Be kind to yourself. You're a work in progress, just like everyone else.
You got to give yourself permission to be human.
Exactly. And that can be so powerful. But what if you've tried all that and those mendokusai feelings are still really strong? What's the next step?
Well, Okada is a huge proponent of therapy. He says that for a lot of people who are struggling with APD, therapy can be a total game changer. He gives you that safe space to explore those fears and anxieties and to develop coping mechanisms that work for you.
And he talks about different types of therapy, too, like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, which helps you kind of identify and challenge those negative thoughts. It's about learning to replace those I can't messages with more positive affirmations.
So instead of, oh, I can't go to that party, it'll be too awkward, it's more like, I'm a bit nervous, but I'm going to give it a try and see what happens.
Right. And he also mentions exposure therapy, where you gradually expose yourself to situations that trigger those feelings of anxiety or avoidance. It's done very carefully with a therapist, of course, but the idea is to slowly expand your comfort zone to prove to yourself that you can handle more than you think.
So if public speaking is something that terrifies you, maybe you start by talking to a small group of friends, then gradually work your way up to bigger audiences.
It's a process, It takes time and effort. But with the right support, it can be really effective. And remember, therapy isn't one size fits all. It's about finding the approach that works best for you.
Like finding the right key for the lock.
Okada also mentions that medication might be helpful for some people, especially those struggling with, severe anxiety or depression. Things like antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications could make a big difference.
But of course, medication should always be used under the supervision of a doctor.
Right. Absolutely. It's about finding the right balance between therapy, medication, and lifestyle changes. And speaking of lifestyle changes, Okada talks a lot about creating a supportive environment for yourself, surrounding yourself with people who encourage you, doing things you enjoy, and prioritizing self-care.
Yeah, like building a strong foundation.
Right. And those safety bases are so crucial, too. Those places or relationships where you feel totally accepted no matter what. Could be a close friend, a therapist, even a physical space that makes you feel comfortable.
It's like having that home base where you can recharge when things get tough. And, thinking about support, Okada has some really great advice for people who have loved ones struggling with mendokusai or APD. What does he suggest? How can families and friends help?
Well, he starts with patience and understanding, remembering that recovery is a journey, not a destination. There will be ups and downs, and it's important to just be there without judgment or pressure.
Yeah, offering support, not trying to fix them.
Right. And creating an environment where they feel safe to talk about their struggles openly. This could mean validating their feelings, offering encouragement, celebrating their successes, no matter how small.
Being their cheerleader, but also respecting their boundaries.
Exactly. Setting clear boundaries and expectations is important too, finding that balance between being supportive and not enabling unhealthy behaviors.
Ogata's book is full of these inspiring stories of people who have faced these challenges and, come out stronger. It really seems like his message is that recovery is possible, even for people who have struggled for a really long time.
He really emphasizes that point. He says, it's never too late to start living a more fulfilling life. And I think that's a really powerful message.
So even when life feels really overwhelming and you're feeling mendokusai, there's always hope. There are things we can do to take back control, to create a life that feels more aligned with who we are.
Absolutely. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are therapists, support groups, loved ones who can help you through it.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive. We've learned so much about mendokusai, APD, and the path to recovery.
I agree. It's been a journey. And I hope it's given you some new insights and perspectives too.
And if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling stuck, please don't hesitate to reach out for support. There are people who care and resources to help you get back on track.
We encourage you to keep exploring these topics, keep diving deeper into the things that matter to you, and until next time, take care.
See you on the next deep dive.